So, with the Silent Hill 2 remake on the horizon, I've been seeing a whole lot of discussion surrounding the concept of remakes, why they're made, why they're necessary, and from the opposing side, why they're unnecessary, and maybe even a little bit problematic. Now, as a young person who is passionate about video games new and old, I wanted to give my thoughts on remakes and why I don't really care for them. Now, before anyone loses their shit, I need to clarify something. Remakes can be great, well-made video games, absolutely, but so can the original games. In fact, they can actually, and get this, they can actually be better. This video could be over with the acknowledgement of one simple thing. Remakes are purely products of capitalism worming its way deeper into the video game industry. That's why they're made, and they're never going to stop until capitalism stops. Nostalgia sells, and 40-year-olds love new versions of their favorite games. But hey, that's not interesting content, right? I'm making this video not just because I'm passionate about old games, survival horrors and RPGs to be specific, but also because I'm passionate about new ones. If this trend continues, some of the brilliant contemporary games my generation adores are also likely to see remakes in the future, and I would really love to bring the remake machine to a screeching halt before that happens. There are many issues with remakes. First, looking through the lens of creativity. They require years of time from teams of people who could otherwise be pushing the industry forward with new titles. Second, they inevitably overshadow the original game, and if anyone can name a remake where this hasn't happened, please let me know. Without which the remake wouldn't even be possible. And lastly, in modernizing gameplay, some things are inevitably lost in translation, and you will change things that some people see as what made the original good in the first place. You can probably see how points 2 and 3 could create a symbiosis of bullshit. Now, let's elaborate on these points. So firstly, let's look at the creative angle. You're a new 2D artist working at a game studio, bursting with creativity and ready to put your skills to work. You've just been informed that your new project is a remake of a 20-year-old classic. Your job is to update the character designs of the original game and bring them more in line with modern standards. You'll be doing this for 2 years. Of course, you'll have some creative freedom because you're not creating exact copies, but all of those ideas you had now have to fit within the box defined by the fact that you are reinterpreting somebody else's work. As a creative myself, this sounds like absolute misery. The moral here is this: if it wasn't for the forward-thinking devs of their time, we never would have gotten any of those classic games. It feels like a slap in the face to those people to remake their games instead of pushing things forward as they did. Do you hear anyone talking about Resident Evil 2 anymore? No, not that one. The Resident Evil 2. Yeah, Resident Evil 2. Other than old people and those who are into survival horror games like me, Resident Evil 2's remake has completely overtaken the original. Now, in the beginning, I said that remakes can be great, and I think Resident Evil 2's remake is a pertinent example of that. The only issue here is, it's not Resident Evil 2. The original game and the remake are two wildly different experiences, as I'm sure everyone who has played them can attest to. Until very recently, you couldn't play the original game via any means other than buying the necessary console and an absurdly overpriced copy of the game, or trying your luck with emulation if you have a PC that can handle it, and hoping to not run into any issues. GOG recently released the original Resident Evil trilogy for everyone with even a half-decent PC to experience, but why did it take so long? And what about current-gen consoles? And what about the fact most people don't use GOG as their game platform of choice? Let's take a trip over to the domain of music for a second and talk about a band everyone knows, the Beatles. In 1971, they released their critically heralded, fan-favourite album, Revolver, and it's still discussed today and widely accessible due to the prevalence of music streaming service. Imagine, for a second, 20 years after its release, I think you may be able to guess where this is going. The record label decided, after seeing how much people love the album, let's re-record this. There are some things we can improve, some slightly out of time guitar phrases, some overly long passages during songs, and let's do it with a different band. Fuck Paul, Ringo, John and George. Let's get James, Jimmy, Linda and Steve. Instead of this horrifying dystopic hypothetical, we received repressings of the record throughout the years. They didn't re-record the whole thing, are you fucking mad? Let's suppose that it did happen, and that new recording became the version that was the most accessible and most widely distributed. The original falls to the wayside and this new, supposedly improved version takes its place. Well, what if some of that sloppiness in the guitar playing was endearing to some people? What if it gave it character? What if those overly long passages were actually building tension within the music to create a greater payoff? I could keep going with this analogy, but I think you get the point. Porting, in very simple terms, is the process of tweaking old games to allow them to run on new hardware. Because the hardware is updated with each new console, many games can't be run on those consoles without some finagling. The fact remakes don't include a port of the original game is, to me, a fucking travesty. The idea you'll have a team of developers interpret the work of those who came before them to make a new product and not include that original product, at least for referencing purposes, is a crime. I completely understand that ports aren't a straightforward process, are often lackluster, and sometimes make changes to gameplay elements no one asked for. I first played Resident Evil Code Veronica via the PS4 port, which doesn't include widescreen capability and is locked to 30 FPS, but this was still better than not playing the game at all, and nobody is going to argue that not porting the game is a better alternative to a mediocre one. While you may argue that a mediocre port could lead to players thinking the game is fundamentally bad, and this is a fair point, but the solution here isn't to not create ports, it's to demand high quality ones and criticize the bad ones. We've addressed what's wrong with remakes and what the solution is. Now let's talk about what their defenders have to say. So here's the two big ones I've noticed. One, they bring exposure to the series, and two, they modernize games for people who otherwise wouldn't play them, and young people and their supposed disinterest in old video games is often cited. The first argument quickly falls apart when you realize that, while new entries in a series also bring that series exposure. Justifying the remake machine because it brings in new fans is like saying World War II was actually good because the Yankee economy boomed in the aftermath. This should be pretty obvious and it feels silly to even talk about, but I've seen this opinion dressed up in so many ways and so many hoops jumped through to try and make it make sense when it just doesn't. To talk about the second, and oh boy, this is where it gets interesting, we have to acknowledge that the whole premise is anecdotal in nature. I hear people don't want to play old games, especially those Zoomers, but I can go to YouTube and find dozens of Let's Plays from people in their early 20s and younger playing 90s games. Is it anywhere close to the number of people playing contemporary games? Fuck no. And that's to be expected. Even if every old game received a stellar port, most people are going to stick to what's contemporary because that's what people have done with all art throughout all of history. There's nothing wrong with that, but think of how much higher the number could be if these games received rock-solid ports for every platform. Speak on my own behalf for a minute. There were so many games I desperately wanted to play growing up, but I didn't have the necessary console and I didn't have a PC. I was limited to contemporary games. I grew up poor. I couldn't afford to do what a certain prominent YouTuber suggests, we'll get to them in a second, and spend hundreds of dollars to play one game. The Sphere Hunter, or Susie, is a prominent survival horror YouTuber who recently made a couple of tweets that really rubbed people the wrong way. Half of what she said is pretty much in line with what I've said throughout this video, but this one is really bad. Now look, I have no ill will towards this woman. I actually started watching her channel during her first year of YouTube, and I think the replies dragged her thoroughly enough. But my god, this is not the way to argue against remakes. You're proposing buying the old console and the old game as an alternative to something nobody was going to be doing. Nobody is going out and buying a PS5 to play the Silent Hill 2 remake. Nobody should have to buy what is now essentially a relic in the history of video games to play Silent Hill 2. This is really a prime example of why Twitter sucks. It encourages people to say silly things they haven't really thought out. There's also the neo-Nazis and the genocide deniers, but we're not gonna go there for this video. It really saddens me that the preservation of video games seems to be less important than other forms of media such as film and music. I wish it was as easy for me to go and play Dino Crisis as it is to watch The Wizard of Oz. I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but the moment my love and my enjoyment for video games became a passion, remakes began to bother me because I see them for what they are. Another disgusting instance of capitalism grabbing art by the throat and throwing it into the dirt. Okay, so that was my first video. I basically speedran this to make sure it was done before the Silent Hill 2 remake, and as such, I've omitted a lot of things I wanted to add, and I didn't go into nearly as much depth as I would have liked to. The script is also pretty piss poor and isn't up to my standard. And so for those reasons, I'm considering this video a prologue to a much larger, more comprehensive video essay that I will work on over the coming months. If you do play SH2R, I hope it's on the high seas. I'll see you there.